make introduce this and sort of set the stage for this, and then my partner Chris Dame will talk us through some specific steps that we think organizations should be going through in dealing with these crises. The topics that we're going to focus on today are, why boards need to get more engaged in this time of crisis, what the individual and committee roles are, and the key metrics that an organization needs to be looking at and projecting. Also, the executive leadership's role in actually developing options to be considered, and the board's role in helping to weigh those options. How then to translate that into an action plan, assigning and managing the rollout of the action plan, and really building a unified messaging system for moving forward. And we'll close by talking about how these crises can potentially uncover opportunities for your organization. Just brief background on us. We've been in operation for about 5 years. Our practitioners have been doing this kind of work, however, for far longer than that, and you'll hear about that later. We are people who've been both in the for-profit and nonprofit world, but have focused on nonprofits, and specifically, how do we help organizations through challenging transitions, whether they be leadership transitions or business transitions. That can take a number of different forms, including interim leadership. And we are 3 partners. We're all on this call, myself, Chris Dame, and Frank Reese. But we have a large group of associates that we work with, depending on the particular situation that an organization has. I'm going to start very briefly with a poll, and I'm going to ask you to take a look at your screen right now, and you should see on the screen a poll. Please, it's just 3 quick questions. Plug your answers in, and I'll share those answers. Just another 10 seconds, and I'm going to end the poll. I think we just about got everybody in on it. All right, thank you so much. So I will end the poll and share the results. And the first question, roles that people serve. We have a little bit more staff leadership than board members. So hopefully this will help staff figure out how to engage their board in helping them through this crisis situation. In terms of the organizational size, a fairly good distribution of smaller, medium-sized nonprofits. And in terms of the focus, lots of service providers, fair number of those in the educational space, and there are a smattering of others. So we will work hard to speak to each of these different areas as we go through this. So to continue on, let's start out with why crises demand heightened board engagement. And to put this into perspective, you've got to take a step back and look at what the responsibilities of a nonprofit board are. And specifically, key board responsibilities are fiscal oversight for the organization, the vision, mission, and core values, board governance, including the bylaws, and hiring, evaluating, and compensating the executive director. This is what the laws actually say boards are responsible for in the nonprofit world. As individuals, board members have other responsibilities. They need to be advocates and cheerleaders for the organization. They need to be supporters of the organization, either giving or getting resources that are needed by the organization. And they need to be active in terms of particular committees and aspects where their skills can be useful for the staff. Note that typically boards are not involved in day-to-day operations, and as staff leadership, you don't want them involved in that. Thinking about the roles, there are the obvious roles we know about of officers, but there are also committee roles, and the ones that really every organization needs to have are executive committees that can be responsive to the needs of the leadership, staff leadership, finance committees that are monitoring the health of the organization, governance committees that are bringing new board members to the table and ensuring that the organization is operating within the parameters of a nonprofit in an appropriate way, development committees to ensure that the funding streams for the organization exist, and an audit committee, which ideally is separate from finance, to provide some real independent oversight of what takes place on an annual basis. The other piece that we want to talk about is relationships, and this is not usually talked enough about. Boards bring some really key things that can be very valuable in times of crises. There's the obvious relationship between the executive director and the board chair, who should, in most organizations, work very collaboratively and supportively in their roles. There's a relationship between whoever's responsible for finance in the organization and the treasurer. Again, these are part of the good functioning of any organization where the board needs to take a strong interest in the financial situation of the organization. But then there are other relationships. So major donors in many organizations, it's sort of left to staff and development folks to make connections with donors and even with agencies. But here's where boards should and can be extremely valuable, because they should be able to bring a network and maintain relationships with that network that can be useful to the organization in collaboration with the staff leadership. Then there are other sponsors or supporters or partners and other enablers that are critical to the functioning of the organization that you need to have long-term relationships with, where board members can and should be valuable in strengthening those relationships, building those relationships, and in times of crises, they're needed more than ever. And then there's the clients themselves. Connecting with the mission and the actions that the staff are doing is really valuable in terms of keeping that commitment and that support from the board to the organization. These relationships become even more apparent in these times, because major crises really force reconsideration of a number of different things. The first, and perhaps the most obvious, is the fiscal situation. We all know that all of a sudden, all of our revenue streams are in question, they're up in the air. And so looking again, whatever you put in your budget, all of a sudden went out the window the beginning of March. So looking at what your current revenue streams are, what your future opportunities are in this environment, and also what possible changes there are in your cost structure that can adapt to any changes in revenue streams. This is an area where the board needs to get involved, because ultimately it affects everything that was planned for from a budgeting standpoint. The vision, mission, and core values, all of a sudden, there's a lot of questions that come up in terms of the focus of the organization. What are we really about? How do these circumstances perhaps change or help us view that vision in a little bit different context? And How are we treating our clients, our staff, our stakeholders? Because that speaks to the core values of the organization. And again, these are things that boards ultimately own on a long-term basis, and therefore need to be cognizant of these kinds of questions. Board governance and bylaws. We talk about expectations of board members. All of a sudden, board members need to be asked for certainly different and often more engagement and support with an organization in this time, including the legalities of delegating authority in a crisis. So oftentimes, the authority for certain kinds of decisions lie with the board chair. It may be that other people need to step in to deal with things that are legally required. Even just the way that board meetings are conducted and the ability to conduct those in an interactive online environment sometimes is not actually allowed in your bylaws and needs to be reconsidered. Again, Chris is going to talk a lot about specifics in these areas in just a moment. The expectations of the executive director. We talked about the board being responsible for that annual performance review, goal setting, and so on. The priorities by which you're evaluating that executive director all of a sudden have to be readjusted to deal with the realities of a crisis. And finally, something that isn't typical, but boards become really important in working with staff or giving confidence to the staff during times of crisis. And also, often they can be instrumental in supporting programs in ways that would never typically happen in a regular environment. Whoops, sorry, 1 second. So a framework for thinking about how to adapt to new circumstances. The mission. Is there a need to adapt the mission? Is there an opportunity to adapt the mission in parameters that make sense for the organization? The infrastructure and funding. Is there adequate access to resources? That may be staffing, financial resources, other things that the organization has depended upon, and whether those still exist in the same form is important in making decisions. The impact on current services. If circumstances lead you to an opportunity to provide some different services, what will that do to the core services that you have been providing? Will it enhance it? Will it perhaps lose focus? These are things you need to consider both in the short and the longer term. The leadership capacity. What do you have the ability to take on? And if you take on more, what might you lose? If you've lost opportunities, if you can't provide your current services, now how can you use that leadership capacity in positive ways to think about either things you can be doing now or ways that you can adapt going forward once you get through this crisis? And finally, stakeholder support. Whatever you do, what are stakeholders expecting? What do they need? And how are they going to view the decisions that you're making? So this is sort of a lens to work with. There's a fundamental question that boards struggle with at these times, and that is how to get involved without getting in the way. What we'd say is the first thing to think about is that if you have been tracking key metrics for the organization, they will provide a way for the board to be able to react to the circumstances without getting deeply involved in the day-to-day. And what we mean by that is the first and perhaps foremost thing that an organization needs to be looking very hard at in this time is cash flow. Not so much worrying about sort of a P&L, but worrying about cash flow. What are the sources of revenues that might be in danger of being lost? what new sources, whether it's the PPP or some other form of revenue, could be available, and what kind of obligations will come with those sources of revenue. And also, what kind of variable costs, and even semi-variable costs, costs that you wouldn't normally think of as variable, but in a time like this, maybe you look at it in a different light, what could potentially be adjusted? So having that dashboard for the board to consider is really important. Second area of metrics is the program impact. How is the crisis affecting the utilization of current services and the continuity of funding of those services? Being able to track those metrics, being able to track the potential need for new services along with funding streams that come with those, and being able to measure the constraints on delivery, whether it's having fewer staff, whether it's having physical limitations as to what you're allowed to do, or a dependence upon partners who are suddenly stressed and can't provide the services that they had been providing in the past. Those are things that are important things to be able to provide concrete numbers for the boards to consider. And finally, the metric of staff morale. Because thinking about what's in the best interest of the staff combined with what the organization is going to need to long-term survive this and be able to retain the key people on the staff or bring back people on the staff, that is a tough trade-off, and the information needs to be out there as to how people are feeling, how people are reacting, what the implications would be of different scenarios. And I'm just going to sort of finish by briefly talking about this division of responsibilities between the executive leadership, who are the ones involved in engaging the staff. They are your number one stakeholders at this time of crisis. The executive leadership develop the crisis intervention options. They are the ones to highlight the impact on the mission, fiscal stability, and the day-to-day operations. Ultimately, they're typically where the communication plan is developed, and they're responsible for execution of that plan. But the board has to be really active in these times in ensuring that the financial projections are realistic. It gives you an objective view of what is and is not possible, of approving any changes in focus of services, because again, that speaks to the mission of the organization, which is ultimately a board responsibility. They're responsible for identifying and assisting with relationships that are at risk. They can be extremely valuable in outreach to those stakeholders who those senior staff may not have time to really reach out to individually. Documenting key decisions. Documenting board decisions is a requirement of nonprofits, and so anything that are significant need to be documented by the board. Thinking about core values and how the decisions you're making affect your core values, because again, those are the things that are going to hopefully be sustained well beyond the crisis. But boards can also be really important in demonstrating support for the staff and for the mission in ways that they typically wouldn't be called upon to do. And finally, that unified message, they need to be messengers for it. So that's the framework. And I'm going to turn it over to Chris Dame, my partner, who has been through crises, as he will tell you in a moment, that sort of portend some of these issues. And he's going to give you a 10-step process to help you think through these issues. Chris?
Okay, well, thank you, David, and welcome, everybody. And we're very anxious to hear your opinions about what you think are good ways to get through a crisis. But we put this tool together, which has 10 steps, which I'll go over with you. And it comes from the work that we've done with some nonprofits like yourselves who have faced big crises. Now, they weren't the same kind of a health crisis. They mostly centered around finance and some legalities. But we think that there were some lessons to be learned, and that's what we've used today to try to help you out. So let's go ahead and put number one up. Face the facts. Well, whatever the crisis is, including this particular one, first of all, the board, and I'm really addressing my comments here to the executive staff and the board working together as a team in ways that normally perhaps wouldn't obtain. But in this particular situation, it is more important than ever that the board get involved with the executive staff, the key staff members, in forming some way to deal with this emergency. And what we call that is an action plan. But before that action plan gets underway or can be articulated, should be shared, it's important for the board to be briefed by the key and the executive staff about what the facts are. Where are we today? What do we know about the crisis, and what do we know about the challenge? What are the decisions that we as a staff think that you as a board are going to have to deal with very quickly now? And a big part of that, as David said, is following the money. We really have to know what is the situation in terms of the financial strength or weakness of the organization. The board needs to know, and they need to know as much as possibly can be gotten together in a realistic fashion, because some painful decisions may have to follow those board meetings. And it's important to focus on some realistic ways to look ahead in the future. The second thing that we would say is really important for the board members to remember and the key staff folks, the executive staff to remember, is step back and relate what you're doing, where you're going, what you're thinking about, what kinds of changes you might make in terms of your core values. What's the best thing that you do in the world as a nonprofit? And what kind of values have you historically adhere to, and how would those values speak to the kind of decisions that you have to make today? And it starts with looking at your mission. And the mission could change. It's possible that some portion of the clients that you've served in the past may not get the same kinds of services or get the services to the same degree. And that may be a fact that you'll have to deal with. And it's important to think about that. It's also important to think about who's going to be working for the organization with the executive committee and the other board members in this crisis and in the future. And it's important to identify who those key staff members are and to build a program so that you can retain them, because retention is much easier than rebuilding. And of course, we have to remember that our stakeholders, particularly our funders, are judging us by how we're going to be dealing with this crisis. They want to know, are the actions we're going to take today to meet the crisis matching up with the values of our organization, the values that we've articulated in our conversations with those stakeholders in the past? Number three, and this is really important, is the concept of being completely transparent. I know from my personal experience, I got into this business many years ago, serving on a board as a board member and opening the newspaper to find out that the president of the electric company was about to shut us down in the dead of winter. We were a homeless shelter because we hadn't paid our electric bill in over a year. And and nobody on the board was aware of this. In this particular crisis, we're dealing with a different set of situations, but there are going to be challenges, severe constraints that have been put on on your organization, and you need to be transparent about that. You need to be talking to the board, you need to be talking to your clients, certainly you need to be talking to your staff, and you need to be talking with your funders and also with the clients, being really upfront and honest about this is the situation. Here's what we think we're going to be doing about it, and we'd like your support, and we'd like you to really help us carry that out. In the past, we've used the words, gee, I'm sorry. In a sense that may also be pertaining today. You may have to use those very words with clients in particular about the constraints that are on you to continue providing all your services, or perhaps providing services to the extent that you did them in the past. And you also, if you are transparent, it's been our experience that that leads to new people coming out of the woodwork and offering to help. In our darkest days back at that shelter that I was telling you about, a gentleman, a businessman in downtown Boston, walked into the office and said, "You prove that nobody stole any money, and I will organize a benefit for you." And that benefit has been going on for 15 years and raising large sums of money because this gentleman walked in and said, "Look, I want to help." He was not somebody who had any relationship with our organization in the past. Number 4. All right. So when we've got the facts, when we have been talking to each other, when the board has developed some mechanisms in the governance process to be dealing with crisis, perhaps they've looked at their bylaws and reinforced the executive committee, or they've developed other committees and they found a way to keep everybody in the loop in terms of what the facts are, what the challenges are. And after the executive staff, the senior staff have had some time to look at those facts and start thinking about the decisions that need to be made, it's time to put together what we call an action plan. And the way we think it's best done in these particular situations is for the staff and the board to work together on this. So it isn't something that the staff does and then brings as a fait accompli to the board members. But no, it's something that at least a portion of the board are actively engaged in. And think about realistically now, what are the decisions we need to make almost immediately in the next 30 days? What are the decisions that are likely to come, say, in 2 months? And then how about in the summertime now? How about 90 days out? Are there some other things that we can over the horizon see are likely to be coming to the board and to the executive director and his key staff members that will have to take action at that point? It's important, as David said, to look at your bylaws, maybe take some action. All of the board needs to be involved in making the important, crucial decisions and documenting them. And that may take some ways of changing the way you've done meetings in the past. Certainly, you're not going to be all getting together in the same boardroom, for example. But you also may be needing to meet more often. Certainly, you need to keep the board members, all of the board members, involved. It may be that you can delegate the ability to move quickly to respond to new circumstances, perhaps new grant opportunities that are out there, to something like a board executive committee. So you need to think about whether and research whether your bylaws allow that. You also need to be honest and be transparent and be realistic in terms of looking at the full range of programs that you're offering. Do the programs, as they're currently or have been in the past delivered, actually match the funding sources you're going to have today and over the next couple months? Does your staff, do the staff who are there, really have the ability to deliver those services in the same way? And then, of course, for most organizations, there's a physical aspect to this. We're not able to shake hands or even deliver packages the same way that we were even a month ago. It's probably going to happen that you're going to be looking at something like triaging programs. There may be some programs that can be suspended. There may be some programs that just have to be eliminated. And hopefully there'll be some programs that can be maintained in some form. So again, that's something that the executive director and the key staff folks need to develop and be talking to the board chair, to the executive committee, and then to the full board in terms of taking action and making decisions and documenting them. But it's important to remember it's also possible out there, if some programs cannot be delivered the same way, there may be other nonprofit or other businesses, organizations in your community that could pick up some or all of those services. You never know. Even in the midst of our crisis in the homeless shelter, we had a food service program, and another homeless shelter in our area was able to assist us in meeting our needs to help the clients who were there. But we had never really explored that until we found ourselves in that particular situation. And there may be new ways that you can deliver some of your programs. Also, in terms of the action plan, it's important to remember maybe the most important stakeholder group in your organization are the staff, and they're going to be impacted by the decisions the board and the executive director and key staff members are making. So it's important to be transparent with them about what the actions are, what the time frame is going to be for taking those actions, what the long-term program impacts are likely to be, and then hopefully when we can start to think about restarting the organization to reach the levels it was at in the past. Realistically, when can staff members expect to hear if they're laid off about when you're thinking about reopening? 60 days from now, 90 days from now, whatever. But again, transparency is important. It's also important in your action plan to have a financial monitoring system for the board, where key decision points are pointed out clearly. You've got some official mechanism to report to the board and to make decisions together, and to look at what your financial resources and needs are going to be. And then also leave room for considering new programs down the way that you can't know about today, but perhaps stakeholders, funders, or government sources will be developing in the future. After we've got the plan, after the board has adopted the plan and documented the plan, and the staff have been briefed about that, it's time to really have the rubber hit the road and implement the plan. So we need to make sure everyone in the board is aware of what the plan is and understands the plan and supports the plan. And if we need to revise the committee structure to meet our monitoring needs, that needs to happen. And we need to point out or build in some mechanisms in the plan to adapt to changing circumstances. It's also been our experience that once you have the plan and you know what the problems are, you face the facts, it's important to take a bold action, to do something in the very beginning. Be proactive, not reactive. Don't wait for circumstances to force your hand. And in doing that, as the executive director and his key staff are doing that, they need to be making sure that the board members know about it, and hopefully the board members will have developed the bold action along with the executive director, but also the stakeholders, so that nobody is surprised about that. And it's, again, we can't stress enough how important it is to make sure that you are talking to the staff early, making sure that they're fully apprised of what you intend to do, and know about what your plan is, and know how they fit into that plan. And also ask for their advice and support. It's entirely possible that some of those folks on the line delivering those services have ideas that you haven't thought of. Particularly if you're a board member, it's not your business to be deep in the weeds in terms of service delivery. And talking and listening to those staff members can possibly come up with some new ideas, good ideas about how you can do better with less. And of course, as we said, it's important to monitor progress so that we can adjust to new realities. David talked about the most important stakeholder being the staff. And it's important that the staff are helped to adapt to new realities. And this involves the board in a way that normally doesn't happen. Normally, as we said, boards do not get involved in operation stuff. But in this particular crisis, and really severe crises, it's important for the board to be seen by the staff as waving the flag, being on site. Now, that's going to have to be done through the media, but the point is, I think the board chair or representatives of the executive committee, some board members need to be seen with the executive director, talking to staff members and helping explain what the action plan is and explain the concern and support you have for all of those affected staff people. And it's important to support the executive director when he or she has to deliver the bad news. There's nothing that's more lonely than telling someone they don't have a job anymore, or they're not going to have a job for a while. And it really helps. I had to do this, and when the board chair came in and sat at the table with me, and with the board chair knew these staff folks, they knew this board person in a way they didn't know me, it just made for a different kind of conversation and somewhat softened the blow. in terms of advice about those difficult conversations, it's important to be clear and visible and to deliver the painful news sooner rather than later. There's no reason to delay telling people what they probably have surmised themselves if they've looked at the action plan and you've talked about program changes that are on the horizon. You need to be clear about when you're going to be making decisions on programs that are going to change in some way. And you certainly need to be hopeful and realistic about when folks might be invited to come back to work. In all of this, the most important thing that people can be thinking about, organizations and departments they can be hearing from, is the human relations department. The HR function is absolutely critical. It's important that the HR folks in your organization help those employees understand whether they're continuing to work or unfortunately not going to be continuing to work. Understand what the compensations and benefits plan of your organization is. And again, it's possible that some of your outside stakeholders, like your insurance company, have support programs and can help you articulate and explain those benefit programs to your employees. So make sure you're checking those things out. And it's also important to be as proactive as you can in terms of helping those employees access outside resources that the government has or other funders have that might be able to shield them or help them in some way get through this unfortunate period. In all of this, as the action plan rolls out, one of the stakeholders that's really important here are the funders, and they need to, they being the funders, need to see how proactive the executive director and the staff and the board are, and because they're expecting that everybody is going to turn to in this crisis. They want to see demonstrated that, particularly at the board level, all hands are on deck. And I think it shouldn't go without saying, but we'll underscore it again. There's only one person who speaks for the board, and that's the board chair. And there's only one person, two people that can speak for the organization, and they should be coordinated with the same message, and that's the executive director and the board chair. It's also, I think, a charge to all of the board members in these crises to look for new financial supporters. People on the board were chosen because of their network out in the community, and that network needs to be tapped at this time in terms of new opportunities that these board members, friends, and colleagues might be able to provide to the organization to help get through this difficult period. And we did in these other crises, and I would urge you to find an opportunity. Unfortunately, it won't be sitting down physically, but to find an opportunity with Zoom or some other way to have very frank conversations with the funders so that they understand what your needs are in this particular situation, what your action plan is, and what you need to know what their expectations are. You need to make sure that for contract requirements, for example, you understand what the compliance requirements are, and you're going to be adhering to them in the best way that you can. And it's also possible to remember that those funders live in a wider world than you do, and they may have new ideas and new resources that they can bring to your attention that will help you in terms of getting through this crisis. The three rules of real estate, everybody knows, are location, location, location. And maybe the three rules in these crises are communicate, communicate, and communicate. All the stakeholders, as we talked about, need to know what your action plan is, and they need to know early. And that includes the board, and includes funders, includes the clients, and it also includes new supporters. If folks come out and say, we're willing to help you, then they need to be assured that you have a good, realistic way to deal with this problem set and you're moving forward on it. We've talked about the fact that the executive director and the board chair need to be talking together. Everybody under the board needs to know what the script is, and there should be a uniform message, but it's also important that individual board members don't take it upon themselves to be talking to the press, for example, or talking to other important stakeholders in the community. It's important to develop a feedback mechanism or some ways that the staff and the executive directors group can be talking regularly to the board, or at least the executive committee or board chair, reporting to the board. There need to be formal decisions taken, as we've said, and they need to be documented. And then it's important in the action plan to think about your communications tools. There may be ways beyond your website, but certainly your website needs to be updated and adapted to this situation. There may be ways that you can use new social media tools. And it's even possible that a formal public relations campaign could be put together that will help you in the community. And you'd be surprised that there are numerous people in your community, and some of them may be on your board, and some of them may be just friends of the organization, who have real skills in terms of professional PR stuff and can come forward and help you craft your message, help you get your message out, and help you explain to the community and explain to funders how you're dealing with the situation. We talked about legal stuff, but it's not just the job of the board chair, but it's also the job of the executive director and his team to make sure that you're protecting your legal back. There can be costly mistakes made, particularly in the HR area. There could be funder requirements, reporting requirements that are slipped. There could be government reporting requirements too. So you need to keep that in mind and make sure, to the best of your ability, that those are carried out. And if they can't be, you need to be communicating with those stakeholders and funders and explaining what the situation is and why it can't happen the way they potentially would like it to happen. We've talked about documenting the key decisions. I can't stress enough how important that's going to be. You need to develop a track record of why you made certain decisions at certain periods of time. And it's entirely possible that somebody on your board is a lawyer, and it's certainly possible that some of their friends are lawyers, and there could be ways that some of those lawyers can give you some informal legal advice and help you think about what the questions are and what the appropriate answers are. And again, it's possible that looking at your charter and looking at your bylaws may be necessary, so you can make some changes in that area to let you move and be more flexible and take decisions earlier. And last of all, who wants to miss what potentially is a good conclusion from this particular crisis? It's entirely possible, as you are moving forward and executing and monitoring, that some new insights are going to be developed about what you do, how you do it, and what the governance responses to that are likely to be. So keep that in mind as you move down the road. So those are 10 steps. We've used these 10 steps in crises. They've proved effective for us. They are, I believe, very flexible, but it does provide a framework for you to organize this very discouraging situation and hopefully find a way to act decisively and to act effectively. David?
You're muted, David.
David, you're muted.
You're muted, David.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Chris, for taking us through that. And I think the slides were sent out with the original presentation, I believe, with the link just a little while ago. So people should have access to those because there's a lot of rich information in them. I just want to conclude by taking a look at the opportunities that come out of crises like this. There are some obvious ones, such as service offerings that you might start to offer leverage, what the organization is really good at and the resources that you have. There are cost-saving opportunities. There are opportunities to explore sharing services or reimagining how you deliver your services that can be long-lasting and can actually change your perception of what you can do, how you can do it, and how you can provide the services that you want to in an even better way. There's also opportunities for individual and organizational growth. In times like this, people tend to take on new roles that they hadn't imagined, and you start to see new competencies. In one organization I'm working with, somebody in the middle of that organization really stepped into this crisis and came up with a whole bunch of ideas and led the charge in terms of thinking about things the organization could do at a time when it was really trying to grapple with all the things all of a sudden it couldn't do. Relationships. It is a chance to reach out to key stakeholders as well as to staff. And those relationships count for a lot down the road. They do open up potential new opportunities for support as well as for engagement. And you learn how people respond to crises. And those insights can be really valuable in figuring out going forward the roles that people might play in the organization once you get back to whatever normal looks like when we are through all of this. Partnerships, really valuable to think about partnerships on the long term. Are there some things, in fact, that your organization could be thinking about that down the road allow you to do things in ways that you perhaps hadn't envisioned? These situations tend to make you think about those things, to have conversations that you've never had with organizations you may have some sort of tacit relationships with, and to think about ways that you could collaborate to really enhance or share your services in the future. We tend not to think about those until times of transition or times of crisis. So now is a really good time to think about those. Reputation. In these few weeks, hopefully weeks, maybe months, your reputation is going to be evaluated, hopefully in really positive ways that will open up opportunities going forward. But affirming your core values and thinking about whether the culture in the organization matches what you want it to be and what you hope it to be going forward is an opportunity that comes out of these situations. And finally, really re-examining the vision for the organization. Sometimes in a crisis, one redefines what it is the organization's all about in ways that can be extremely powerful. So, and I'll give you one last example here. For instance, I'm working with an organization that is an arts organization that people typically visit. Obviously, those are all shut down. So they're really thinking about how, in a virtual world, they can share their incredible intellectual property, and that could reshape that organization. Just in conclusion, and we're going to leave about 8 minutes for questions, we have set up a weekly Zoom meeting, same time, next Wednesday and the following Wednesdays through May, where we will be available, and we would encourage anybody who just wants to sort of brainstorm challenges that they're dealing with right now, questions that they have, to join us and have that conversation. And if nobody joins us, that's fine. If a lot of you choose to join us, and we can really have a vibrant ongoing dialogue really around these issues, because we're all learning as we go along, I think it will be really powerful. So again, the link is in the slides, and we hope to see some of you, many of you, one time or more over the next few weeks, and we're here to support you in that. So with that said, why don't I open it up to any questions? And I think we're going to do this by people just raising their hands.
David, we have a couple of questions that are pretty good ones. One is how to reconnect or connect more effectively with our donor base is one question, and a related question that's come up through the chat is this a reasonable time for us to re-examine our sustainability model and how we are funded as an organization? You want to take on those?
Sure. Chris, you want to take a first crack, or you want me to?
Chris, you're muted.
We're learning the technology.
Get with the technology, would you?
Okay. In terms of the second one, repeat that one to me.
Sustainability.
Sustainability, yes. I think this is it's not a perfect opportunity, but it's a very good time. It's one of these crises not to waste. Taking a good hard look at how you finance what you do and whether changing that pattern would lead to a better outcome in the future, apart from the crisis. I think that's a really important question. And I think getting the executive director and his staff team together with perhaps some portion of the board to think through that and see how it develops over the next 30 to 60 days, and then see what kinds of changes really make sense. That could lead to some interesting outcomes.
But as far as the funders go, it can be a really good time to reach out, not to necessarily tell them what you're doing. You should be telling them what you're doing, but to ask what their expectations are, because they know what's going on. They know what you can and can't do. And rather than sort of guessing that you have obligations that come along with the funding and you have to somehow make up for those, reach out to them and ask the question. You know what we're going through right now. Let's talk about what your hope is that comes out of this as far as the use of those funds that you provide us. And again, asking the board to get involved, because there's only so much capacity you might have in the staff to do that with the key funders. Board members are often very happy to either participate in a call or to initiate one if they have some kind of a connection.
Another question, fellows, is this a time to re-examine a budget? When we went into the crisis, the budget was reasonably optimistic and a little bit aggressive. Is this a time for us to scale back and redo a budget?
I would say that you absolutely need to review the budget and really develop some scenarios and some decision points, because we don't know how long this is going to go on. We don't know the depth of it. So it's not obvious what all of the changes to a budget might be, but there are certain key decision points that you might use to determine which, how much you are going to need to adapt that budget. Chris?
I'm not going to answer that one. I'm not going to add to what David said, but someone else had asked whether, in terms of the communication part that I was stressing, whether clients have a role to play. And my answer is absolutely. I think finding a way to have some, there are multiple mechanisms that you can use, but finding a way for clients to give you some feedback. The people who are I'm talking now about social service organizations, I suppose, but the people who are getting the services, listening to them, understanding what they think, and also hopefully getting from them some new ways to think about meeting their needs can be quite valuable. And it's, I think, a way to build support in the community.
Eileen Sussman had raised her hand. Eileen, do you want to go ahead and ask your question?
Yeah, thank you very much. So I have an interesting challenge. First of all, a number of months ago, I announced my retirement. And so since then, the staff has been quite challenging and difficult, trying to vie for attention with mommy leaving and trying to vie for a position. And this has made it even more difficult. And so my question is, what do you do with a group of staff, as a small staff, who is challenging, difficult, and also going rogue? making decisions on their own.
Well, the first question I'd ask, is there already a person who you've identified? Have you, who's going to be taking on that role at a certain point in time?
It's not going to take place until the end of December, and so they're about to make that announcement and to start that search.
Yeah. It's not unusual for staff in any transition to have some real challenges sort of dealing with the implications for themselves of that transition. And certainly uncertainty is perhaps the biggest thing that any of us have to overcome. So this is especially a place where board reassurance that there is a plan and that the organization has a vision for where it's going can be extremely valuable and might be more listened to, if you will, than what might come from you, where they have the perception that you're not going to be around to have to deal with the fallout of all of this.
So my question is, how do I deal with them when I'm having my meetings with my biweekly meetings with them? What do I say to them when they get challenging?
This is Chris. I would add to what David said, thinking about your problem set. I think they need to be told, we're not going to be talking about future leadership here or major changes in the way things are currently happening until X month. And the board will be advising you through me what those changes are, but it won't happen until a date certain, and here's the date certain. So you try to calm the waters in terms of everybody getting their oar in. And then I think you need to, I would think that the executive director in this situation needs to reinforce the fact that they have been instructed by the board, they've been chosen by the board to set policy and make decisions. And if the second meeting, the clarification hasn't taken, then I think I would bring the chairman of the board to the next staff meeting and have the chairman look them in the eye and say, I don't want people calling my board members. I don't want the board, I'm speaking for the board now, we do not want independent decision-making about program decisions. All decisions are coming to us, the board. We are the ultimate legal decision-making authority. We are talking to your executive director, and that's the way it is.
Thank you.
Yep.
It's helpful.
I'm just going to pop in really quick because I realize that we're at the 2 o'clock mark, and I want to be mindful of everyone's time. So I just want to extend my thanks both to all our participants who stayed with us to the end, and also thanks to our presenters for sharing their expertise on this topic. As was mentioned at the beginning of the session, we will be sharing a recording as well as the PowerPoint with everyone. So you will have those resources, including information on how to access these weekly meetings that David has so graciously offered. So with that, I will say goodbye to everyone. And encourage you also to fill out a survey that will be coming with those resources. Do you all have any closing words, David or Chris?
No.
I wish everyone the very best in a difficult situation.
Yeah, thank you all for your time, and we're happy to continue these conversations and learn from each other as we go forward.
Yes, thank you everyone, and stay safe.